Welcome back to Giorlando with Giorlando. In today's video, I'm going to talk about another deck that is really near and dear to my heart for quite a few different reasons, and that is none other than the Reborn Tengu plant variant from the end of the 2011 year. So I'm talking about after the September 2011 ban list. Now, for anyone that played back then, we're talking 10 years ago, 2011 is a really interesting year because we saw the release of Trishula, Dragon of the Ice Barrier. We saw the release of Tour Guide. We eventually, by the end of the year, saw Exceed Monsters, which this Tengu plant variant would utilize. But we also saw the release of Reborn Tengu, a TCG exclusive that had a massive impact on the metagame. A ton of different decks ran it. A ton of different decks ran it with different purposes as well. We saw everything from scraps go undefeated during at least the Swiss rounds of the US Nationals. We saw TGs win the US Nationals utilizing Reborn Tengu and its synergy with Horn of the Phantom Beast. We saw at least getting second at Nationals, a Reborn Tengu variant at the hands of Sam Pedigo, and then a Reborn Tengu variant by the end of the format in the September 2011 season. So that year, I think personally, is marked more by Reborn Tengu than anything else, because we basically saw a variety of decks try to utilize Reborn Tengu in different ways. And of course, you had other things on the sides, like Six Samurais, Monarchs, Gravekeepers. But to me, the real prominent card that pushed through the national season and then persisted into the 2011 September season was Reborn Tengu. And to me, the deck that utilized it the best was none other than Tengu Plants. Now, context is everything, and the 2011 September season is one of the most fascinating moments in Yu-Gi-Oh! History for a few different reasons. At the very end of the summer of 2011, so before the September list took effect, there was one YCS with Exceed Monsters legal. YCS Indianapolis at Gen Con, won by Robert Boyajian. At that event, the rules regarding Exceed Monsters were not solidified in the way that they are today. The judges there sort of had to think on the fly and make decisions about the ways in which Exceed Monsters work that are no longer applicable today, certainly not applicable at all. And the big rule at that point in time was, were Exceed Monsters still classified as on the battlefield? The answer, at least at this one single YCS, was yes, which means if you had Utopia and you detached Reborn Tengu from Utopia, you actually got to search for another Reborn Tengu. It was still classified as leaving the field because we had yet to solidify in the rules what that gray area meant when the monster was still technically on the battlefield, kind of, but it was at least overlaying into an Exceed monster. That was also true with Sangan when you're using Tour Guide from the Underworld. So if you went Tour Guide gets Sangan and then overlay, at that point in time, the only monster you could go into was Granosaurus, so it wasn't great, but that Sangan protected underneath the Granosaurus would allow you to search for a monster. So it was protected from Caius. It was really this crazy thing where if your opponent had Granosaurus out with a Sangan underneath, they were going to get a search, typically for Effect Veiler to counteract your opponent's own Tour Guide plays. So this really unique, fascinating moment in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, and I imagine you can think of other interactions. Dandelion, for example, still worked, but that was essentially how they were ruling it. They were ruling Sangan almost like Dandelion detaching. Well, things changed, but in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 September ban lifts, they had yet to solidify that rule. When things shifted over from the summer into September of 2011, the big deck that everybody was talking about was Master Hyperion Agent variants, because recent shifts in card pool made it so that that deck almost seemed as unstoppable as Dark Armor Turn did back a few years prior, because if Exceed Monsters detaching cards like Sangan allowed you to search on the spot, the brand new Exceed Monsters that came out on the eve of the YCS in Toronto 2011, September 2011, won by eventually Billy Bray, the Exceed Monsters that came out at the eve, specifically Leviathan Dragon, meant that on turn one, you could go Tour Guide get Sangan, go into Leviathan, immediately detach Sangan, search Effect Veiler. Well, if you're running a deck with Agent Monsters and the newly unbanned Black Luster Soldier, plus cards like Chaos Sorcery even, you immediately had a 2500 monster, 2 darks, 1 already in the graveyard, and a light in hand. It made it so that Chaos variants utilizing that interaction were considered borderline unstoppable. And when you add into it the other Exceed Monsters that were released, like Gachi Gachi, which obviously worked well before the ruling change with agents, ones like Venus allowed you to go into Shine Balls, and then subsequently into Gachi Gachi, everybody felt like the agent deck was borderline unstoppable with these ruling changes. Lo and behold, before YCS Toronto, just a couple weeks, Konami officially solidified the way Exceed Monsters work. No longer were you able to detach a Sangan off of a Leviathan and search. Technically, no longer would Reborn Tengu be detached off something like Utopia and also search. So it really put into place the Exceed Monster rules that we have today. But for this window of time, virtually everybody was playtesting variants of this broken agent deck that allowed you to search Effect Veiler on turn 1, turbo out a Light in the Dark in the graveyard immediately, fueling the newly unbanned Black Luster Soldier. So when we went, and when I say we, the group of people that I went with to YCS Toronto in 2011 was my friend Paul Clark, Joe Bogley, and Jesse Samek, so 3 really close friends of mine. We drove out to Toronto, all running plant variants, and what was interesting about this time period is this deck would go on to win the YCS, but going to Toronto, plants were in many ways discarded for a couple different reasons. One, this deck was also affected by that Exceed monster ruling change. Reborn Tengu was not quite as good, and this deck utilizing Sangan off of Tour Guide also lost out. In addition to that, the ban list absolutely slaughtered Tengu plant variants. I'll actually show you the ban list and parts of the ban list to really put this into context. This is a screenshot of the 2011 ban list. Debris Dragon, pivotal part of this deck. It was at 2 during the summer, limited to 1. Lone Fire Blossom, massive component of tons of different combos. The fact that you were able to run double Lone Fire made it so that Call of the Haunted or Monsterborn plus Lone Fire made an insane board during the summer. Still made a good board in the fall, as history would show, but it wasn't quite as powerful. That limitation was really pivotal as well. And if you go down to the spells, there's even more limitations that affected this deck. This deck had one of the best Pot of Avarice engines out there. You had the Tour Guide, which fueled 3 monsters right off the bat. Reborn Tengu itself was incredible with Pot of Avarice. Well, look, Pot of Avarice went from 3 down to 1. So there were several key elements of the Reborn Tengu variants with the plant engine that were limited going from the summer into the fall. And then take a look at the Synchro monsters here under the limited list. Formula Synchron, which was at least in 2s, limited to 1. TG Hyper Librarian, there were variants of the deck during the summer that could summon double Librarian in multiple Formula Synchrons all in one turn, drop 4 to 6, 8, 10 cards. Limitations there. Trishula, not that you would often run more than 1, but Trishula was a major component of plant variants, limited to 1 as well. So if you take a look at this ban list, it had several major restrictions on Reborn Plant Tengu variants heading into September of 2011. But there were some loyalists. And I can think back to this time period and remember it as clear as day. I can probably still pull up some of the old text messages from 10 years ago where, whether it was Paul and I, whether it was talking to Jesse, Joe, all the people that I went with, we still talked about, is there any potential here? I think plants might still be good. I think Reborn Tengu is powerful enough, and I think this deck utilizes Reborn Tengu really well, and Tour Guide from the Underworld, that this deck might still have some potential. And again, this is in a time period where a lot of people were going into the event thinking that agents were the best deck, far and away. So when we go to the event, people are looking for Leeching the Lights, looking for cards that counter the agent deck. But in the back of our mind, we were pretty confident, I still think plants are good. So we ended up running plants. Paul, Joe, Jesse, and I, and then a variety of other people who we collaborated with through text messages during the couple weeks leading up to the event. We ended up all running a plant variant. And it ultimately worked out really well. There were very few players in the room at YCS Toronto that actually ran plant variants. As a matter of fact, I got to round 6. I was 5-1. So I guess round 7, I was 5-1. And I played against an agent deck. And on the first turn, I summoned Lone Fire, and he goes, plants? Really? I haven't seen one of those. So, I mean, I got halfway during the Swiss of a tournament, running what I thought was the best deck, the deck that won the event, the deck that took half of the top 32 spots. And people didn't even know it was a consideration. People didn't even think it was competitive at that point. So this was really one of the most fascinating events because so many things coalesced all at the same time to produce this really awesome singular event. We had ruling changes, threw everybody for a loop. We had a really incredible ban list that came out. We had a new mechanic that was really recent, the YCS monsters. We had a deck that was probably the best deck in the room that most people didn't even consider competitive at the time. And tell me how many times that has happened in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So there were all these really interesting environmental factors that make this one of the decks that I really look back on and enjoy. Because working with Jesse and working with all of these people that I went to the event with, but also that I was in communication with, showing up to the event and seeing players like Billy and Frazier and Alistair and Jesse and all of these close friends of mine all run plant variants or something close to it and doing really well was really validating. Because then the next following month, YCS Columbus, Cat was out of the bag. Plants probably made up 40% of the room. It was clearly the best deck, or at least the most popular deck. And a lot of the same players that did well at Toronto were able to back-to-back top. This was a really awesome and a memorable portion of my career, because looking back, The deck building and the communication and the community about that plant deck at Toronto, and then harnessing that, refining it over the next month, working with people, and then seeing a lot of those same names like Sean Montague and Robert Bayajian top back-to-back events really solidified for me the value of not even necessarily teams per se, because these people weren't quote-unquote teammates at that point, but just communicating and having that hive mind where you're bouncing ideas off of people and then discovering what ultimately was arguably, I don't think much of a debate at this point, but arguably the best deck in the room at Toronto. And then clearly it was so good that Billy was able to win back-to-back YCSs with it. So we're going to profile this deck. We'll talk all about it, but I do want to put that there into context. Though before we do, this ban list had some other interesting insights that I want to point out. Number one, Royal Oppression was banned. Oppression was limited before, but now finally plant decks, these type of special summon-centric decks, free reign. There's no more Royal Oppression. People have yet to really start playing Vanity's Emptiness. So Royal Oppression is unbanned. Sneaky big deal. Other sneaky big deal? Giant Trunade was banned, and instead we had the unbanning of none other than Heavy Storm. That's a huge dynamic. The trap-heavy decks like Gravekeepers, which were a bad matchup during the summer, are now way easier with access to cards like Heavy Storm. You know, Giant Trunade can delay, but if your opponent has a hand trap and you push into Trunade, you're going to lose. Heavy Storm, on the other hand, if your opponent doesn't have Solemn Judgment or Starlight Red, they need to respect it all game, no matter what. If a trap deck sets 3 back rows and say, hopefully they don't have heavy, and they have heavy, that's game breaking. So now you have to sit 1 or 2, and now you might not set yourself up in as much of a defensive fortress as you want when playing against some of these special summon-centric decks. So that unbanning of Heavy Storm had a massive impact on the playability of some of the decks. I mean, think back to the summer, as I just alluded to. TG variants with a lot of traps, cards like Horn of the Phantom Beast, that won Nationals during the summer of 2011. We had decks like Gravekeepers and then 6 Samurai decks with tons of traps dominating 2011. We had cards like 7 Tools of the Bandit that was a borderline staple in the summer of 2011. Not so much by the fall. By the fall, the unbanning of Heavy Storm single-handedly flipped the format on its head. All right, we'll begin the deck profile with 3 copies of Reborn Tengu. This is, of course, Tengu Plant, so we'll have the full 3 copies of Reborn Tengu before it was eventually limited to 2. We also have 3 copies of Tour Guide from the Underworld. Ideally, on the first turn, you either normal summoned Reborn Tengu or Tour Guide from the Underworld. They both progressed your game state in slightly different manners, but they progressed your game plan either by putting a floater on the board that would combo really well with your tuners or Kayas, or allowing you to search out Sangan, which could then subsequently search a copy of Lone Fire Blossom or a tuner, or honestly maybe even a hand trap depending on the makeup of your hand. So really one of these 6 monsters on turn 1 was really ideal. Worst case scenario, you could have also normal summoned one of the 2 Thunder King Rayos. Double Thunder King was really common by YCS Columbus. Again, to put into context this deck profile, this is the exact deck that I ran at YCS Columbus in 2011. This was right after YCS Toronto, which was the first YCS where this new variant of Reborn Tengu ended up top 32ing and then, of course, winning in the hands of Billy Brake. By this point in the format, it was really clear that this, plus also decks like Agents, were going to be at the top, and Thunder King did a great job not only giving you a light monster for BLS, but slowing down some of the synchro and now exceed summon-based plays that were being made. From that point on, we'll take a look at the hand trap. I elected to run 2 copies of Max C, 2 copies of Effect Veiler, and then the single Gores. By this point, many players started to run 3 copies of Max C and then 1 copy of Effect Veiler. I always had the mindset during this part of Yu-Gi-Oh's history that yes, obviously Max C would be fantastic in the mirror match. It would be fantastic against some of the other powerful decks like Karakuris. But when you went into a YCS, many of those rounds you'd play against decks that were way off the beaten path, rogue decks, and that absolutely happened for me. Round 1, I played against Gladiator Beasts. I actually vividly remember it. Cards like Effect Veiler, on average, tend to be a little bit better against those trap-heavy rogue decks. So I wanted the 2-and-2 split. That way I felt like I not only covered the mirror match a little bit, I also covered some of the rogue matchups. In addition to that, it's not like Effect Veiler is that much worse than Max C. Quite frankly, Effect Veiler can be used almost as well as Max C, depending on when you drop it. In addition to that, it's also a tuner and a light monster, so I thought it had some good utility there. Plus, you could use, of course, Max C and Effect Veiler in the same hand. If you had double Max C, which would be more likely with 3 copies, you might have opportunities to get stuck with a Max C, which is not necessarily the most ideal thing in the world. Sometimes with this deck, you make only 1 real big push. So sometimes having double Maxi might actually be detrimental. But I ran 2 and 2, and then Gores was pretty common, basically a staple at this point. Obviously, there were cards like Solemn Warning and Enemy Controller. Good players typically played around Gores really well, but then there were plenty of circumstances where players were caught off guard by Gores or like simply did not play around it efficiently. And if that was the case, your Gores could really be game-winning. From that point on, we have the Plant Engine, which is actually not a ton of cards. This is called Tengu Plants, but basically all of these cards had been limited to 1 at this point. Lone Fire in the prior format was a 2. It was limited to 1 by this point. Debris Dragon was a 2 in the prior format, now limited to 1. Dandy had been limited to 1 for a while, though there was iterations of plant variants, particularly Drill Warrior-based variants, where Dandelion was a 2. Glow Up Bulb would never really be run at more than 1, and same thing with Spore, although these cards actually have been limited to 1 in their history, even though they're once per duel. But this was our little Plant Engine. All searchable by Sangan, which made, obviously, Tour Guide into Sangan a really powerful play. Each of these cards comboed really well with cards in the deck like Reborn Tengu. Maybe not as much Debris Dragon, but certainly some of the others. And actually, by this point in time, you could summon Debris Dragon, go into a monster, maybe even float something like a Dandelion, and still exceed into Utopia. That was now a new play relative to the beginning of this format regarding the release of Exceed Monster, something that was not prior. From that point on, we have a couple sort of big boss monsters. A lot of people at this point in time ran double Caius. I elected only to run 1 Caius because one of the major changes that most plant players made between Toronto and Columbus was to cut Call of the Haunted. I felt like Call of the Haunted did a good job giving you the tribute fodder for Caius. And if I was going to cut Call of the Haunted, which I did, it's a preview of the traps, but basically everybody playing plants did, I didn't want to have multiple Caiuses in my deck. And I lost in the top 32, but at least got me up to the top 32, so I don't think I missed a second Caius, though if you go and look at some of the top deck lists, whether it's Robert Bayajan or some of the other people in the top 32 of that event, you'll notice Caius was in multiples in many of those deck lists, but I ran the singleton copy. Then BLS was recently unbanned for the first time since GOAT format, which might contribute to the fact that we have 4 light monsters in the main deck. And in the prior format, you might see Effect Veiler, probably not Thunder King, but now we actually need to have some light monsters in the deck. The extra light monsters were definitely there, and we'll talk about in a little bit, but it was nice having targets in the main deck, particularly Sangan targets like Effect Veiler. But that's the singleton BLS. Moving on into the spell lineup. The spell lineup was basically a collection of power cards, at least relatively speaking. You had 2 copies of Enemy Controller. This card might not seem all that important, but if you go back and play this format, this might arguably be the most important spell in the whole deck. There are so many plays where you use Enemy Controller, get rid of your Reborn Tengu or a Dandelion token, take control of a big monster, swing for game, put tokens into attack mode. And the real big thing about this card is it allows you to play around Gores really well. Because depending on the board that you can create, you can use a monster that's already declared an attack to take control of your opponent's Gores. And at that point, even though they typically would summon it in defense mode, if you can then attack over the token, you can finish them off by attacking for game. I can't even begin to tell you how many times that you would use Enemy Controller to play around Gores. Gores was one of those cards that against really good players, I typically sided out just because this deck had a lot of tools to play around Gores, from the Enemy Controllers to the Solemn Warnings and the Trap lineup as well. But double Enemy Controller, unbelievably important. This deck played a lot like a beatdown deck at times, using cards like Thunder King Ryo, using cards like the Leviathan that you could go into off of double Tour Guide, or the Reborn Tengu, just to sort of beat down and whittle your opponent's resources before making a synchro play. Enemy Controller was one of those cards that helped both game plans. It could help you beat down by shifting big monsters into defense mode. It could also take monsters that you could use to combo with some of your plant cards. So it really filled a perfect position in this deck. We then had 2 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon, and at this point, the recently unbanned Heavy Storm. In the prior format, the summer of 2011, Giant Trunade was legal while Heavy Storm remained on the ban list. One of the big changes between that format and the beginning of the current format that we're profiling was the unbanning of Heavy Storm. This had a massive change on Yu-Gi-Oh! It made cards like Trap Dust Shoot quite a bit better. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. It made it so that some of the trap-heavy decks like Gravekeepers got quite a bit worse because they started to overcompensate for the legalization of Heavy Storm by putting multiple cards like Starlight Road in their deck, which might have been quite a bit situational. So Heavy Storm, huge unbanning, had a massive effect on the makeup of the format. From that point on, we have some more power cards. We have Singleton Dark Hole. So we actually had Dark Hole and Heavy Storm legal. 2 board wipes for the first time in quite a long time in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. going all the way back to some of the sort of advanced traditional days, having both of these cards unbanned. We had another power card in Monster Reborn. Comboed really well, obviously, with cards like Lone Fire Blossom. You could open Lone Fire and Monster Reborn, and you could go and get a Dandelion in defense mode, Reborn the Lone Fire Blossom, and from that point, you had a few different plays. You could tribute the Dandelion to get out a plant and get 2 tokens. Sometimes it was actually better to tribute the Lone Fire to go into something like Spore and then go into a level 4. It really sort of depends on the makeup of your hand, but Monster Reborn to combo with the Lone Fire. You had Foolish Burial, which obviously could send cards like Dandelion, Glow Up Bulb, Spore, and then even in some cases a light monster to the graveyard. We had one single Book of Moon. It was limited to 1. We had, before moving on from Book of Moon was a particularly important card because some of the ways that you would OTK or OTKs when your opponent had Reborn Tengu on the board, if you were able to Book of Moon your opponent's Reborn Tengu face down and then remove it from the field through a card like Bryonak or Trishula, it wouldn't trigger the Reborn Tengu's effect. So there were a lot of times your opponent felt like they were well protected because they had Tengu out. And then you would use Book of Moon, flip it face down, and then OTK them through the Reborn Tengu. So this card was a little bit more important than it might seem. We had 1-for-1. 1-for-1 was a massive power card that obviously typically searched out a tuner like Glow Up Bulb or Spore. In the most perfect world, you're sending Dandelion and not getting Max Seed. That would be the most ideal circumstance. We had a single copy of Scapegoats, comboed really well with all the tuners. End phase Scapegoats into Lone Fire was a really powerful play. It also worked really well with some of the cards in the side deck that we're going to talk about. One copy of Mind Control. It was limited to 1. This deck has a bunch of tuners in it. Synchro monsters, obviously around for a while, which was one of the first reasons why Mind Control rose in popularity. Now we have at least a few Exceed monsters to combo even more with that singleton Mind Control. And then we have Pot of Avarice. This card was limited to 1 at the beginning of the format. In the prior format, many people ran multiple copies of Pot of Avarice, but this was one of the several limitations to the plant deck at the beginning of this format. So the 1 singleton Pot of Avarice. One of the major themes that you might be noticing as we're progressing through the deck profile is that a lot of the cards in this deck were recently limited as a result of the prior ban list. Actually, quite frankly, most of the major power cards and plants had experienced some type of limitation, such as Lone Fire Blossom, Debris Dragon, and Pot of Avarice. This is the precise reason why a lot of people discredited plants as a deck going into the beginning of this format, and why this deck took a lot of people by surprise at YCS Toronto. From that point on, the trap lineup, Solemn Warning was limited to 2, so we're going to run exactly 2 copies of Solemn Warning. We probably would have ran 3 if it was legal, but it wasn't. Single copy of Solemn Judgment to go along with the 2 warnings. Then the rest of my trap lineup, somewhat atypical. We had the Torrential and the Dushu. These were definitely typical. If you were to go back in time to YCS Toronto, which was, of course, the event prior, my trap lineup also included a copy of Call of the Haunted. I ended up cutting Call of the Haunted, but nevertheless, I should point out that I did run Call of the Haunted in one of my variants of this deck. From that point on, my other 2 traps are a little bit unorthodox. I ran a copy of Dimensional Prison. This was very unusual. I ran a copy of D-Prison because, as I alluded to earlier with cards like Effect Veiler versus Max C, I typically liked hedging for some of the rogue matchups, which I thought were really tough. One of the rogue matchups that was especially difficult during this format was the TG matchup. I'll talk a little bit more about TGs when I get to the side deck. But all of the TG monsters are basically floaters, almost like Sangan, and if you could banish them, they wouldn't get their effects, allowing them to search out more. So Dimensional Prison allowed you to have a pretty versatile card in general, but a card that was really good against one of your toughest matchups. I'll talk more about Deep Prison in a little bit. And I actually main decked 1 copy of Debunk at YCS Columbus. I figured virtually everybody would be running hand traps. And in addition to that, if you're not running just hand traps, you're probably going to have a card like Sangan in your deck, or Reborn Tengu, or at least something like the Plant Engine that I could hit. I remember hitting game 1 a Goblin Zombie and a Plant Zombie variant, and the opponent was really freaked out. They almost called for a deck check, assuming that I somehow knew their deck ahead of time and that I put Debunk from my side deck into my main deck. But nope, I actually main decked a copy of Debunk. I only drew it a few times in the event, but I remember it always being pretty good. It was really awesome in game 1 because one of the biggest fears of going for some of your best plays, like 1-for-1 Dandy or Monster Reborn Lone Fire, the fear is that your opponent's going to max C you. Because in either of these circumstances, if your opponent holds the Max C properly, they're going to hit you for 2 special summons. if you 1-for-1 dandy, it has to be 2, because you're going to get tokens, and you're going to get a level 1 tuner. If you Reborn the Lone Fire, or rather, if you play Lone Fire and tribute it to get Dandelion. So just to clear the mat here, you go summon Lone Fire, activate effect, and get Dandelion. If then you activate Monster Born and get the Lone Fire Blossom, most good players at this point, if they had Max C in the hand, would say, sure, no response. If you were to Max C right here, your opponent would theoretically have the ability to stop in only 1-for-1 with the Max C. Maybe they have some traps for protection. If you allowed the Lone Fire to hit the board, then your opponent would tribute off the Dandelion. And as a result of that, they would get 2 tokens and a level 1 tuner from their deck. Well, now all of a sudden, if you Max C at this point, now they're going to be priced into special summoning again. And at this point, you're already getting 2 draws. You're getting draws for, obviously, the Spore that came out, but you're also going to get draws for the 2 Dandelion tokens. So a lot of times, this was a more ideal location to Max C off of the Reborn Lone Fire play. Because here, now your opponent's probably going to say, all right, how about we both draw a card, and I'll end the board here with a Formula Synchron, and now you end up drawing 3 cards off Max C, and your opponent only ended up drawing 1, and ends with a somewhat unideal final board. This, I mean, what are you going to go into a level 5 or a level 6? That's not really all that threatening. None of those are really going to be interruptions. So having a card like Debunk in your main deck allowed you to make some of the powerful plays that this deck allowed without worrying about being hit by Max C. So that was why I ran a card like Debunk. We'll go with the extra deck first, and then I'll talk about the side deck, because when I talk about the side deck, I'll talk about some of the expected matchups. Another card that was limited during this format was Formula Synchron. Prior to this format, people typically ran 2 copies of Formula Synchron, but it was limited to 1. I remember in the first match of YCS Toronto against Jarrell Winston, I actually really wished I had a second copy of Formula Synchron. It cost me round 1. And I remember thinking back to myself, oh, why did I play this deck? It's not full. It's missing all these pieces. And then I ended up winning something like 6 in a row before I lost again to Jesse Samick. I remember ending that day 6-2. You had 1 copy of Armory Arm. Armory Arm was really good with cards like Black Luster Soldier. If you're familiar with sort of 10-year-old Yu-Gi-Oh! If you equipped Armory Arm to Black Luster Soldier, it boosted it to 4,000. But with Armory Arm's effect, when it destroys a monster by battle, it inflicts damage equal to that monster's attack. If your opponent has any monster in attack position, the Black Luster Soldier can attack over it. The difference between the 4,000 attack of Black Luster Soldier and their monster, plus the attack of your opponent's monster, is always 4,000. So it would attack over a monster for 4,000 and could attack directly for game or attack over just 2 monsters. So Armory Arm comboed for an OTK with Black Luster Soldier. It was also really easy to go into just in general, and was the only level 4 synchro monster worth running. We had 1 copy of Cataster. Cataster was at this point the best level 5. You could, I guess that's a little bit debatable. The best utility level 5. Your combo level 5 was, of course, TG Hyper Librarian. And a lot of times, even if you weren't comboing, you could end with TG Hyper Librarian, because it would act sort of as a pseudo Royal Oppression, where yeah, your opponent could special summon into it, but if they were to get over it, they probably would have to special summon multiple times. So these were your 2 level 5s. It was easy to go into level 5s because when you banished Spore from the graveyard with Lone Fire Blossom or Dandy, it became a level 4, and then you could either use a Scapegoat or a Dandelion token to go into one of these, so these were actually pretty common. We had Bryanak. Bryanak was just a power card at this point. Easily one of the most powerful level 6s of all time, that and probably Goyo Guardian. Goyo Guardian was banned at this point. Bryanak was the only really significant level 6. It allowed you to Book of Moon, Reborn Tengu, and bounce them to hand in order to OTK. So Bryanak was really pivotal. Technically, there was one more level 6, but it wasn't super common to go into. I mean, there were times that you would go into it, but I think Bryanak was probably a little bit better. The best reason to include Orient Dragon in your extra deck is in order to use Debris Dragon, you need to special summon a Dragon Synchro monster. So this deck included Dragon Synchro monsters like Ancient Fairy Dragon, not that it might not otherwise, but cards like Black Rose Dragon, Orient Dragon, because all of these monsters were dragon monsters that you could go into off of a Debris Dragon, which is sort of this portion here of the extra deck, where we have Orient Dragon for a 6, the only level 6. Technically, you would need to bring out a monster and typically synchro the Debris Dragon with 2 tokens to actually go into a level 6, but that play technically happened. Sometimes you would do it. In the prior format, people ran cards like Raikou with a little bit more frequency, and you could bring back the Raikou with Debris Dragon and go into Iron Chain Dragon of all things, which obviously not a super powerful card. So I guess in that sense, Orient Dragon was an upgrade. It allowed you to get rid of your opponent's synchro monsters when it was special summoned, so it wasn't horrible by any stretch. Definitely warranted a spot. Ancient Fairy Dragon had a lot of defense. There were actually field spells in this format that were used, like Necro Valley, so it had some utility there. It was also a light monster, which again shouldn't be neglected. Sometimes the extra normal summon mattered too. You could bring back, or rather special summon a Lone Fire from your hand and keep comboing off. That was particularly useful if you had Hyper Librarian on the board. You could make some really elongated plays where you special summon 4 or 5 times from the extra deck and got a ton of draws. So yes, it's a dragon, a lot of defense, light monster, combo piece, definitely warranted space in the extra deck. Black Rose is basically a staple. It was really easy. You could Debris Dragon, Dandelion, Black Rose as one of the most classic plays in Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Stardust and Scrap Dragon, the 2 most powerful level 8 synchro monsters that were dragons. They might even at this point in time be the most powerful level 8 synchro monsters in general anyway. Particularly Scrap Dragon. I really loved Scrap Dragon because if you were able to bring back, let's say, a Dandelion when you had a token on the board already, when you brought back that Dandelion, you were able to tribute off, or rather synchro summon all of them into Scrap Dragon, and then after Scrap Dragon came out, then you would go and get 2 tokens back from the Debris Dragon, rather from the Dandelion that the Debris Dragon brought back, and then you'd have an easy pop on one of your opponent's cards. So that was really one of the best plays to do. And then you had, of course, Trishula, the best synchro monster of them all. It was also limited to 1. This deck had a lot of easy ways of going into Trishula, particularly with Debris Dragon. Debris Dragon bringing back Dandelion with 2 tokens would be 4 plus 3, and then that would equal 9. There were some interesting plays, for example, where, of all things, you would actually want to bring back Lone Fire Blossom. Now, Debris Dragon negates the effect of these monsters on the field, but you could actually bring back Lone Fire Blossom and tribute off Dandelion, and sometimes doing that, even though you weren't going to be able to special summon, would produce tokens that you could then use to go into Trishula. So, for example, if you're looking at my board now, this can summon Trishula. This cannot summon Trishula. This is too many levels. This is level 10. But you could actually use the Lone Fire Blossom that you got off of the Debris Dragon to send the Dandelion to the graveyard, get 2 tokens, and from this point you could go into a Trishula. The other cards in the extra deck were a copy of Steel Swarm Roach, which was good against the Hyperion decks, the Agent decks, a copy of Utopia, which was the other rank 4 at the time, and then for rank 3s, you only really had Leviathan and Leviair, which were both really good, don't get me wrong, but the extra deck was quite limited at this point, so we only had 4 Exceed monsters that were even printed and worth playing. Cards like Granosaurus weren't great. All right, so now we're going to transition to the side deck. Before I do so, I want to point out some of the matchups that you could anticipate. Karakuris did fairly well at YCS Toronto. Players like Dale Bolito and Anthony Alvarado ran them. Jeff Jones topped with the Karakuris at Columbus, so you could have anticipated running into Karakuris. Although Heavy Storm was unbanned, it wouldn't be impossible that you ran into Gravekeepers. I remember playing Gravekeepers on the bubble of Toronto in the prior YCS, so there was definitely a possibility. It wasn't super popular, but it wasn't impossible to run into X-Sabers. YCS Columbus 2011 was the last event that one single Dark Soul could trigger multiple searches during the end phase. That rule would be changed thereafter, meaning if you revived the same Dark Soul multiple times in one turn, at this event you would get 1 search per each revival, and each time it was sent to the graveyard, which mattered. Fultro might bring it back, then you would synchro with it. Gotham's might bring it back, Gotham's Emergency Call, then you'd synchro with it, maybe another Fultro. You could end up using 1 Dark Soul to search 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, depending on your makeup of the hand. This was the last event where that was a thing. I vividly recall Sam Pedigo actually playing X-Sabers at Columbus, because from his perspective, it was the last time that he would be able to play one of his favorite decks in full strength. So you could theoretically run into X-Sabers. Then you had sort of a collection of skill drain based decks. You had hero decks. Dan LaMartina topped Columbus with a hero-based deck. You also had Horn of the Phantom Beast decks based on TGs, like Rush Rhino, Striker, and Werewolf. This was a really common anti-meta deck. I lost to a TG deck in this event. From that point, you could also run into the ever-popular Agent deck. Agents were one of the most popular decks at the time. So, of course, they were Agents. And then there were the brand new Dark Worlds. This was the first event that Dark Worlds were legal. None of them top 32'd, though. Brandon Wigley got to 8-0 with a copy of them before getting disqualified from the event. So there were some Dark World decks. I didn't actually end up playing any in the main event, but obviously there were Dark World decks. And then the mirror match. So the Plant mirror match was, of course, the other anticipated matchup, the Tengu Plant mirror match. In terms of side decking for all of this stuff, I'll move this over to the side, and then we'll start talking about what I side decked at this event and some of the logic behind it. I side decked 2 copies of Cyber Dragon and a Chimera Tech. These were designed to counteract the Karakuri deck. The Karakuris are all machines, so by utilizing the Cyber Dragon package, you had a really awesome side deck plan. You would end up side decking out a card from the extra deck, such as Ancient Fairy sometimes, maybe even Orient Dragon. Orient Dragon was okay in the matchup, but you would end up siding something out of the extra deck. Maybe not Roach, because Roach did a pretty good job stopping these big synchro monsters, but other than that, you would find something. I sided 3 copies of Gemini Imps. Although I never ran into Dark World, I was scared like crazy of running into them, so the triple Gemini Imps are there to stop cards like Dark World Dealings and card destruction. I side decked 2 copies of DD Crow, which was really good against Dark World. It was also really good in the mirror match. I sided 2 copies of Leeching the Light. I did not run Leeching the Light at YCS Toronto, although I knew about the card. I actually showed up to that event with a bunch of them, gave them to friends like Steve Silverman. Leeching the Light was designed to be used against the Agent deck. The most ideal circumstance would be to use tokens from Dandelion or scapegoats that ideally made it to your turn. So, for example, you set Dandy, they attacked it, your turn you started with 2 tokens. Then you could take those 2 tokens and shift them to attack mode, Leeching the Light their biggest monster, and now you have 2 Leeching the Lighted tokens with a lot of attack that could hopefully win you the game. And the best case scenario would be if you had scapegoats. You know, if you had 4 scapegoat tokens, turn them all to attack mode and leached the light on your opponent's biggest monster, you could very easily win the game like that. So Leeching the Light was there for the Master Hyperion based decks. We had another copy of MST, helped against some of the rogue matchups that we were talking about, like the Skill Drain decks. I also sided 2 copies of Bottomless Trap Hole because they also did really well against some of those. I played Gladiator Beast round 1 of this event, and it typically does really good against those type of decks too. In terms of other cards, so this was the bulk of my extra deck, or side deck. Other cards that I ran included Mirror Force. Mirror Force, just a generally good card against the field. Maybe in retrospect, it should have been another copy of Dimensional Prison, but nevertheless, I did side a Mirror Force. Cards that I sided at Toronto that I did not side at Columbus. At Toronto, I sided Double Breaker. In Columbus, I kept the plants in, typically games 2 and 3. At Toronto, the first event of the format, I did not. I sided into a way more anti-meta build with cards like Breaker instead of Debris Dragon and Dandelion. So I upped cards like Mirror Force. That's partially why I ran a Deep Prison in the main deck. And then I'd come in games 2 and 3 and hopefully catch you with dead DD Crows and Max C's in your hand by beating you down with these big attack monsters. At Toronto, I also played a copy of Chain Destruction, which was a Chain Disappearance, was a decent side deck option because it counteracted Tour Guides, it counteracted some of the plant monsters. A little bit situational, probably in retrospect wouldn't have ran it at Toronto, but nevertheless, this was the Tengu plant deck that I ran at YCS Columbus in 2011.